Hi, welcome to a special edition of Beyond the Fundamentals. In this video, we're going to deal with the issue of what do you mean by King James Version only? In this video, we're going to deal with the issue of what do you mean by King James Version only. The reason we're going to deal with this is multiple-fold, but this is a very special edition. As you can see, I'm not in my usual setting. I'm actually seated in a hotel room in Brooklyn, New York. I'm traveling for my job. I am an IT critical infrastructure project manager, and I am in Brooklyn, New York yes, I have a secular job. You wonder why I don't put out as many videos as I can. I have a secular job that I have to work until this ministry picks up. So in an effort to put out more content, I'm going to see if I can film some things while I'm on the road. Recently, I got a message from James White where he's talking about how he commented on one of my videos. And in one of my videos, if you've watched my channel at all, you know that I hardly ever deal with the King James Version issue. What I deal with most of the time is lately we've been dealing with Calvinism and how it's infiltrating into non-Calvinist churches, trying to help equip Christians to deal with that. Well, what happens sometimes when you're dealing with Calvinism is a Calvinist will find out something else that you stand for, and they will try to use that label to pigeonhole you, like we talked about some of our previous videos, to pigeonhole you into a label that they can just pre-classify as no longer credible. Your arguments in any category are no longer credible because of XYZ. And they'll use dispensationalism that way, they'll use insults that way. And the King James Version issue comes up and it gets used a lot that way. Now, James White did that specifically. What I was doing in the video was I was making the point in my Ephesians 1:4 video, the chosen in him, the censored video from over a year ago, well over, maybe 2 years ago. I don't remember how long ago that was. But we're dealing with that issue, and the point at hand was that Calvinists have their philosophy because they reject scriptural authority. So instead of actually addressing the text at hand, where the point in the text was that Calvinists conversationally, I'm not making the claim that they don't address the phrase in him in Ephesians 1:4 in their writings, but conversationally they promote the Calvinist viewpoint by referring to Ephesians 1:4 or paraphrasing it or quoting it without the phrase in him. And that phrase in him. And the larger point being made is that a lot of Calvinist positions, actually every distinctly Calvinist position has to be made on rejection of scriptural authority. There is some scripture somewhere to which the Calvinist is refusing to subject himself in their pursuit of Calvinism. Now, when James White dealt with this, he evaded dealing with the actual substance altogether just by making the assumption, oh, I guess this is his King James only versionism talking, and then didn't deal with it. Well, actually, that's not my King James only versionism talking. When it comes to Calvinists rejecting scriptural authority, that has to do with any Bible, anything that you call a Bible, Calvinist, that you're willing to put in front of me. I don't care if it's a Greek text, I don't care what translation into English it is, anyone you're willing to put in front of me, you reject the authority of that Bible. So it's not a King James Version only issue at all. But a lot of you are non-Calvinists out there and you don't agree with me on the King James Version only issue. But I need you to listen to me, not because of this issue in particular, but in the tendency that Calvinists are going to try to find other things that you believe and try to discredit you because of that issue, especially if it comes with a lot of stigma, like this particular one. Now, personally, well, I'll get into that later. So what happens all the time when this issue comes up, the King James Version only issue, it usually comes up as a sidebar where a conversation started about something else. And when people bring up the King James Version only issue, I hesitate to say 100%, but very, very close to 100% of the time, people go against the King James Version issue based on ignorance and lies and things that they assume about people who hold the King James Version only position that they don't know. And these are unvalidated assumptions. And James White does this. Now, James White should know better, because James White wrote a book called the King James Only Controversy, which has been thoroughly discredited, by the way. There are all sorts of contradictions in there, all sorts of inaccuracies and fallacies in there. But anyway, he wrote a book on it. He is aware of the issue. He's looked into the issue, but he makes these misleading comments anyway. And if you follow the mainstream thought of academia and you want to be respected and you want people to like you, you know you do not want to be called King James Version only. I know that people don't want to be called King James Version only, okay? So whatever, if you're not King James Version only, you're against the King James Version only movement or issue or whatever it is, I know that you're thinking of all kinds of snide little snarky comments. I'm thinking about disabling the comments in this video just because of that. I know nearly 100% of the comments will be things that you can find on the first page of a Google search that you think I've never thought of before. But I've thought of it, I've seen it, and I'm really not interested in your input. I've looked into it. But we're going to cover this issue. So when you deal with King James Version only folks, what I'm asking as a King James Version only person is if you have something in mind, when that phrase comes out, King James Version only, something passes through your mind. You get an idea of what a King James Version only person is, KJVO person is. And what this video is about is to indicate or point out, expose the fact that whatever it is that passes through your mind when you hear that phrase is probably 90% of the time inaccurate. And in an attempt to bring a little more light to this topic so that it can be dealt with in a more charitable and knowledgeable fashion, what I'm going to do is I'm going to present here common assumptions. What do you mean? So if I made a chart here, it's a single picture you can download on the website, and I'll have the link in the description below. And hopefully with the equipment that I have here, I can get it posted onto the screen so you can see it, but it's on the website. It's in little red writing in the Bible version section of the video. And so you can click on this chart. I actually put this chart together on a lunch break one day on a whim. Just put it together after getting fed up about people lying about this particular issue so often. So what I've done is I've written some things. In this video, I'm going to read what I wrote and I'm going to make a few loose comments on them, and I'm hoping that this will help set the issue straight. So before people go attacking the King James only version position, if you're doing so on one of these issues that I'm going to list, then you're wrong. And you need to readdress why you're against the position or why you're going to try to critique the person you think you're against, all right? We probably have more in common than you realize, and you probably have a lot of false assumptions that you don't realize. Now, I know that a lot of you listen to my channel not because of this issue at all, and I get it, but this is where I come from, and people use this. But I'm not in the business of trying to hide any positions that I have, and people do use this position as they will use your positions against you. This happens to be one of mine. So I want to share this and hopefully bring some enlightenment to this. And maybe you can find some parallels. Maybe you don't happen to have this issue in common with me, but maybe you can see where people have false assumptions about other positions that you hold, okay? And this might be helpful in that way. So what do you mean by King James Version only? The motivation behind this list stems from the fact that every time, and I don't mean most of the time, I mean every time someone has deliberately and publicly opposed my position on Bible versions, they have had to lie about me and my position. Every time. Whether it's in a church, whether it's in a Bible study group, whether it's a controversy with the ecumenical Bible study group that's going on a military installation somewhere, any time, whether it's online, whether it's from James White, any time I've been publicly opposed on this issue, they have had to lie about my position in order to oppose it. So I believe that the King James Version is an accurate and living rendition of the words of God in English, and that no other version in English compares to its potency and spiritual fruit. However, there are a lot of misconceptions about King James Version only people, so much so that if someone asks me if I'm King James Version only, I almost have to say no if what they have in mind when they use this label is any of the things that follow in this chart. So if you have any of the below assumptions in mind when you employ the phrase KJVO or King James Version only or King James only, then no, I'm not what you have in mind. So the first assumption, that KJVO people start with the King James and we have the assumption that it's perfect from the start, from the beginning. No, that's not our starting point. Our research into the matter starts with the assumption that the KJV is not necessarily different than any other version. It's only after the process of elimination of corrupt versions that the KJV is the only viable candidate left standing. Number two, there's an assumption that we don't access or refer to the Greek or the Hebrew. No, that's not the case. I refer to the Greek and the Hebrew not only in my personal study, but also live on demand when teaching in public. Number three, have the assumption that we use the King James or believe it because we prefer it. No, it is not a matter of preference at all, especially in the flesh. Now, I would much rather endorse a Bible version with a lot less reproach, but I really don't have a choice. If you're going to follow Christ, you're going to have reproach. And it just so happens to be that this book, there's something special about this book. And if you're honest about it, you're going to have reproach about it. So the King James Version only position is a matter of spirit-led research and conviction. Now, my personal preference, I wish the Third Millennium Bible, I wish it was up to par. If only some of its errors and problems could be addressed, that would be a great alternative to be able to hand somebody. In my flesh, I would really love to be able to hand you a Bible version other than the King James that's whatever it is you think a Bible version has to be able to offer people in this Burger King society. Have it your way right away. But I don't have that option. I've looked at them. I've waited till Bible versions have come out with bated breath, and then I run up and I check it out, and within 10 seconds I find major flaws that underlie the ulterior motives behind which the version was produced. And then once again, there's still only one book left standing. So it is not a matter of preference at all. It is a conviction, not a preference, that requires my support for the King James Version. The fourth assumption is that it's the only one we use. No. I display 11 different versions on screen while I'm teaching in public. I'm quite happy for people to see the differences for themselves, and it's not the only one that I use. It's just the only English translation that I believe. The fifth assumption, that's 5, is that we are opposed to alternate wordings either via commentary or in the margin for clarity. No, the KJV translators advocated various other translations to be supplied into the margin to give a sense of how else a word or a phrase could be rendered. These suggestions are still available in the Cambridge KJV Bibles, which we highly recommend. We also recommend the Defined King James Version, which supplies definitions in the margin for all words that might be considered archaic, for example. The sixth assumption, that we don't think a person can get saved out of any other version. No, that's not the case at all. We frequently recommend to lead lost people to Christ using their own Bible that they already have on hand, regardless of what version it is. The seventh assumption is that we condemn and reject from our assemblies people who still use or believe other versions. No, many people come to our church with an NASB or an NIV or even a Living Bible. Ironically, some of these people are our biggest supporters. My biggest supporter lately was a person who's actually using a Living Bible. And that's even when this issue was employed by dissenters in an attempt to cause division. So in a church I was at recently, the Bible version issue came up because somebody wanted to notice it's never King James Version people who cause the division about this issue. It's always people who are against King James only who use it to cause division. Bear that in mind. But when that issue came up, the people who came to my defense the biggest, one of them used an NASB and one of them used a Living Bible and came to my defense because of my position and how honest I was about it when I showed up, and how I was being lied about by those who were going against my position. The eighth assumption is that we are following a man, or that we necessarily agree with or take for granted everything spoken by other KJV advocates such as Ruckman, Grady, Gipp, Cloud, Ripplinger, Bergen, Chick, Talmage, Spurgeon, whoever. No. Now, while we have arrived at similar conclusions and positions regarding the Bible version issue as some of these other people, there is actually great variance among the reasons held for the position. Many within the King James Version only camp consider the positions of others to be even heretical for some reason or another. Okay? So King James Version only people are not monolithic on this issue. 9, a false assumption. And it's sometimes hard to tell if somebody's really that dumb when they use this, or if they're just saying this out of spite. But the assumption that we think Paul used the KJV. No. The King James Version was commissioned in 1604 and published in 1611, with the printing press finally matching the translation work in 1769. So that would be highly anachronous, since Paul was a first century Christian. Also, none of the biblical characters or authors spoke English, since English didn't develop as a language until centuries later. Paul and the other New Testament authors produced the manuscripts on which copies the KJV is based. Corruptions of those manuscripts form the foundation of almost all versions produced since 1881. The 10th assumption is that we think the Textus Receptus, the TR, is perfect, or that Erasmus's Greek New Testament solely represents the TR. No. Now this is from Edward Hills, but the translators that produced the King James Version relied mainly, it seems, on the later editions of Beza's Greek New Testament, especially his 4th edition, but also they frequently consulted the editions of Erasmus and Stephanus and the Complutensian Polyglot. According to Scrivener, out of the 252 passages in which these sources differ sufficiently to affect the English rendering, the King James Version agrees with Beza against Stephanus 113 times, with Stephanus against Beza 59 times, and 80 times with Erasmus or the Complutensian or the Latin Vulgate against Beza and Stephanus. Hence, the King James Version ought to be regarded not merely as a translation of the Textus Receptus, but also as an independent variety of the Textus Receptus. And that comes from Edward Hill's book, The King James Version Defended, chapter 8. Now this, to follow what we were talking about earlier, follow James White's comments earlier. He was talking about having a discussion on Ephesians, and you can exegete the King James text and I'll exegete the Greek. And he uses the phrase the Greek, and I know he knows better than this. I know he knows that every Greek text that's available out there is an eclectic Greek text. You say, what do you mean by that, Kevin? Nobody who has studied the Bible version issue thinks that when they read the Greek, they are actually reading for sure what Paul wrote or dictated. They know they are reading an eclectic text. They know that there are scores of texts available for each passage in the New Testament. There are over 6,000 manuscripts and papyri available for the entire New Testament, and different passages are represented at least scores of times. And when you read a Greek text, such as the Nessels-Allen-Metzger text, you're reading an eclectic text. In other words, the best guess of all the texts, and they don't match what their best guess is of what they think it really said, because we don't have the originals. But he wants to make you think there's just as many Greek New Testaments as there are English translations, if not more. So there is not one Greek text. There are lots of different eclectic texts, which, as you can see from that paragraph, disagree with each other quite a bit. So when someone says, I'll be reading from the Greek because I'm so smart and I just have to show it to somebody because I'm a freaking 4-year-old and I just have to boost my ego in my own way that way, or you can use the English King James Version over here because you're just an absolute simpleton, okay? I'm not going to sit here and try to lie to you that I can produce a single text and guarantee for you forensically and scientifically that is what Paul wrote in the Greek. But and he wouldn't come out and say it that way, but he is content to use the phrase the Greek and leave an unsuspecting person or other imbecile, i.e. seminary graduate, to think that he is actually reading exactly what Paul wrote with no chance of variance. Now, the 11th assumption is that we think that the spelling, the typesetting, the font, etc. was error-free at the printing press right off the bat in 1611. No, the translation work was. We are very well aware of the differing updates to the printed editions, bringing it in line with the translation work itself. The edition that matches the font and spelling that we now use, as well as the original handwritten translation work, rolled off the Cambridge presses in 1769. A lot of times these imbeciles will try to stick a 1611 facsimile in front of your face, where the F's look like S's and the V's and the U's are mixed up, and that sort of thing, and the I's and the J's. And they'll try to say, see, look, you can't even read the King James Version 1611. And when they do that, they're just making fools of themselves. The 12th assumption is that we believe the Word of God was not available prior to 1611, or that it's not available in other languages. No, this is nonsense. The correct manuscripts have been faithfully rendered into many languages for many centuries. Our major concern is not with what was going on before 1611 or what is going on in other languages. Our main concern is the corruption that made it back into the mainstream starting in 1881 with the Westcott and Hort Greek New Testament, which successfully shifted trusted academia toward faulty historical theories and bad manuscripts. Amidst so much ubiquitous corruption, the KJV is basically the last pinpoint of light still piercing through the darkness. The KJV has its counterparts in other languages, such as the Reina Valera in Spanish and the Diodati in Italian, etc., and that are based on faithful manuscripts. I lived in Italy for 2 years, and the people who follow the correct text, they get the Diodati. And then there's the Neo-Diodati, which is like the New King James Version here. So there are 2 Bibles everywhere, not just in the United States. It's not just a King James Version only thing. It's not like everybody has to speak English, okay? The 13th assumption is that we oppose any attempt for a new translation. No. We very much welcome an attempt at a new translation. It just happens to be the experience of history that every attempt since 1881 has been plagued with faulty motives and bad theories, corrupt manuscripts, etc. Now give us a translation that stems from sound motives, sincere people, faithful manuscripts, sound methodology, etc., and we'll gladly have a look. But after the last 350 attempts, we aren't exactly holding our breath. Now the 14th assumption is that we think the KJV is arbitrarily magical. No. The Word of God is supernatural by its very nature, Hebrews 4:12. It bears this supernatural quality in any faithful rendering in any language. It just so happens that amidst the all-encompassing Laodicean error and corruption that exists in every other version produced since 1881, that the KJV happens to be the lone salient example of the Word of God in English that has withstood the test of time. So there are 14 assumptions, and there are probably more that could be added to the list. So if any of the above assumptions are what you have in mind when you employ the phrase King James only, then no, I'm not King James only. In other words, I'm not what passes through your mind when you hear that phrase. It's just that all the other recent attempts at a Bible translation fail all the quality control tests. The KJV is simply what we are left with, and we recognize with no fear of proclaiming this post-investigation finding. I don't say that begrudgingly, we are thankful for it. May the Lord bless you, and good day.